Next, how Ramses' responsibilities propelled him into a world where he would become a living god. Coming up next, Ramses the warrior fights for his homeland and agrees to sign the very first peace treaty in the history of man. Next, exactly what drove the pharaoh into the beds of countless women and why.